the room and online. I'm Ritu Metsimolotsane from the National Business Initiative, and I'd like to welcome you to the session that we're looking at adaptation and partnerships, and really how to build the resilience and adaptive capacity across the South African landscape. I'm very pleased and would like to extend a special welcome to the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal, the Honorable Ms. Nomusa Dube-Ncube, and our esteemed panelists who will be giving us different perspectives of how we can form these partnerships on such a crucial and particularly important subject. So we know that emissions are on the rise, and therefore the pressure that's placed on different actors, but often those who are most vulnerable, our communities, really does increase. And as part of building this capacity to respond to climate change, to adapt, to build resilience, we need to come together in our different capacities as well as our respective spaces. So in this regard, provincial and local governments are really integral in mobilizing the systems, in making sure that we put in place those key resources and the enabling environment that will allow for our communities to thrive in the face of increasing global warming. And of course, on the other side, the private sector, civil society are other key societal resources that need to be activated in terms of the skills, in terms of connections to the community, and just making sure that in the different decision-making spaces in which we exist, we're able to consider the needs of our societies at large. We're able to harness the collective resources and the skills that are sitting across these different spaces and really come together as a country to build the resilience that we need to have in the face of increasing climate change. In terms of how the session will run, as I mentioned at the beginning, we do have the Honourable Premier who will be joining us, so she will make some opening remarks and really set the scene for us, but we are joined in the room by those other voices that form part of these important collaborations and collective action that we need to see, who will then share insights and really some of the practicalities of how we make these collaborations come to life. So it's my pleasure to call upon the Premier to really set the scene for this discussion and give us a context, and thereafter we can delve into more conversations around how we respond.
Thank you very much, facilitator. Apologies. Allow me to acknowledge my fellow panelists and all the representatives and delegates to the session. I would premise my few scene-setting remarks by highlighting that although the Africa region does not have, at least at the moment, a common climate plan, but the regional leaders have declared in Nairobi Declaration as follows, that I quote, "We commit to developing and implementing policies, regulations, and incentives aimed at attracting local, regional, and global investment in green growth and inclusive economy." And this is what the African leaders declared in their statement. So what do we then see as the role of government within this context? It is to develop a policy and create an enabling environment for businesses and the industry players to thrive and to create the much needed job opportunities. The Provincial Growth and Development Strategy, as an example of KwaZulu-Natal, has given a high-level overview of the development vision of the region and across all areas of development to give effect to the meaning of sustainable development. Today's discussion, although is not limited to climate change related to public-private partnership collaboration to both reducing the risk and to invest in the climate-related work programs. The high-level indicators relates to the expansion of the application of green technologies. This gets broken down into specific indicators to be achieved within the next 5 years. And if we look at our MTSF, we have 3 projects that we've put there, just an example, that give effect to the green technologies, namely the small and large-scale energy efficient projects, about 1,500 megawatts of power produced out of energy efficient technologies. We are also in the process of collecting a 5-year data to show progress on how this has been or could be achieved, and working with the private sector and the state entities. So as recently as a couple of months ago in our Climate Council, we adopted the Climate Strategy Implementation Plan, working with the Cabinet. And in the light of the fiscal constraints that is faced by government that all of us are now aware of, in generally and in the sub-Saharan Africa or region in particular, there has been a number of initiatives such as the one that we're going to be talking about here, the public-private partnerships. And in the climate change strategy, the implementation plan, for instance, the private-public partnerships can find its clear role in industries such as the one of industry manufacturing and agro-processing, energy, waste management, tourism, amongst others areas. In the energy space, we need to be looking at how the private sector is going to generate the off-grid renewable energy to alleviate the pressure of Eskom, while they are able as well to sell back some of the excess energy to the state. As KwaZulu-Natal, we are in a process of establishing an independent power producer program for the province in order for us to contribute towards the economic recovery plan that we have devised for ourselves. We have also identified renewable energy and energy efficient components that can be manufactured in the province, that we need the private sector again to manufacture and be able to set up some of those businesses, including the small businesses. The private-public partnership as well need to understand that the responsibility within ensuring that with regard to the reduction of the emissions, the private sector also need to play an important role there. Hence, we have, even in our Climate Council, a good participation of private sector. If we look at other technologies, the industrial and the manufacturing processes that could benefit from the hydro fuel technologies, as you would know that hydrofuel technologies provides an opportunity for us to be able to generate energy without or with reduced gas emissions as opposed to other sources. And certain industrial manufacturing processes are or could use effectively this technology as well. And that could help us again, reduce the emissions. If we look at the tourism, we have about 75% of our province has got tourism establishment or tourism, facilities that are owned by private businesses or privately owned businesses, and which facilities can utilize quite a significant amount of water and energy as well. And if you look at some of the partnerships that we can try to look at, that we can work together in the transition of these facilities, we can see both water and energy, again, getting into the conservation and looking at other alternative sources that could help us save the water. And in many instances, we always lament about using potable water or drinkable water for things like gardening, things like manufacturing, industrial. And those are some of the areas that we would want to see private sector playing an important role in terms of realizing that the resources that we have are very limited, but also in terms of reducing the emissions. The other area is the compliance with the environmental laws and regulation, which is a critical component, again, of protecting the infrastructure that the private sector also need to be looking at. I know sometimes private sector will think that some of these regulation and environmental laws are erroneous or they are, a nuisance. But what we need to understand is that if we are, to have our environment being saved, if we are to sustain our environment, we need to understand these issues. It's not just a nice to have, but it's something that should be built into our practices, but also into our businesses. Let me also touch on the incentives of development for green growth in relation to the reduced cost of doing business. The fees of processing permits are very minimal on the side of government. Professionals involved in permitting systems being regulated through professional registration and the pro bono supports being proposed for small businesses. All of these could be done with businesses to thrive and the businesses to benefit as well from the both worlds in terms of growing our economy, but also from our side in terms of creating those much needed jobs. As I draw towards my conclusion on my remarks, one of the areas is the environmental impact assessment of climate change guidelines, which also seek to cushion the business from the climate vulnerabilities and also to protect their investment. I've just given those few examples of collaboration and some of the areas that we can look at as private and public partnership and collaborate on. There is more that needs to be done, but we have to start somewhere. And I'm grateful that the NBI in this initiative with the private sector efforts and SASO is really going to take us a step forward in terms of ourselves as government and the private sector beginning to put something on the table to say these are some of the deliverables that we can be looking at. And in achieving these commitments, various countries in the region are implementing policies and frameworks. And South Africa, for an example, has just developed the Just Transition Framework as well as the Just Transition Investment Plan. And there is some of the repurposing that is due to take place. The innovation and the skill injection of this curriculum is one of the areas that needs to be an ongoing, plan. Our National Ports Authority, managed by Transnet, is working also on tirelessly retrofitting the infrastructure with energy-efficient technologies. The transport sector on the other side, we are also ensuring that we look at how they are rolling out their infrastructure and how they are making sure that they're building some of these safeguard policies and initiatives that can help all of us. So what I'm hoping to learn from the speakers and the various engagement that we should have is some of the successes and the failures and factors and advice on how do we deal with these issues internationally, but also at the local level, but also going back at home. How do we make sure that whatever discussion that is taking place is taken forward? The view of one private sector members, hoping that we will speak with the one voice, with everybody else. We also need to understand the international practices, for example, that will enrich our knowledge base, but also moving forward, some of the partnerships that we already have. I mean, we have quite a few partnerships with various governments, states, as well as the nations as governors. And some of the initiatives that we see there, resource mobilization, skills development, technology sharing, and some of those practices can again be useful for us to take them forward so that we enrich our knowledge and our actions plan moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Premier, for really setting the scene and the scope of, I think, in some cases, the challenges, but also the opportunities that are sitting in addressing something that is really critical across so many, different spaces. I think, it's apt to reflect on how this South Africa Pavilion, for example, is one of those instances of partnerships and really a space where we can come together, we can start to build, I think, the trust, the networks that then allow us to take forward creative but also practical ideas and implement and respond to some of these big challenges that we are facing. I think it was also very apt how you've brought in this understanding of, the role of the economy. So obviously in responding to climate change in its different facets, whether we are trying to reduce emissions or we are building adaptation, we are building resilience and the capacity to implement that, there are opportunities that are crucial for our own economy. So in providing the jobs, in providing the opportunities to localize, to beneficiate, to build industries that are, I think, that are sustainable, but that contribute to the broader sustainability and resilience of the country in a way that safeguards our future in the context of climate change. So I think those are really important key points that you've brought forward, and we really do appreciate those insights. As I mentioned right at the beginning, we are quite fortunate in the variety of voices that we have in the room, and really also coming to this space already with, primed to build the partnerships, primed to get the insights and respective kind of positions that will contribute to effective implementation of climate change responses. So just in terms of setting, and getting the conversation going amongst our panelists, I'd like to call on Councillor Xola Phakati. And Councillor Phakati is also the Deputy President of the South African Local Government Association, just to give us a context on public-private partnerships and specifically the mechanisms and frameworks that have been put in place. We understand the unique challenges that municipalities face, and just your reflections on how that framework, the mechanisms, and the specific kind of initiatives or anything that's referenced in the framework can really enable stronger, longer-term, impactful partnerships going forward. Okay. You're welcome to. You can stay there, or we can.
Thank you, Chairperson, for the opportunity. I would like to greet the Honorable Premier of KwaZulu-Natal Province, Premier Nomusa Dube-Ncube, Dr. Storm Patel, Head of Global Climate Change and Policy at SASOL, as well as Jordan Harris, the Executive Director, Regions 4. And greetings to you all, distinguished delegates. Early in 2022, the South African municipalities met at a national conference, and among other things discussed was the state of infrastructure services at a municipal level. In that discussion, municipalities acknowledged their limitations given the requirements for investment in new infrastructure to address historical deprivation as a result of the previous policies, as well as to provide services to meet the new socio-economic needs, refurbish old infrastructure and improve maintenance. This challenge is compounded by the need to respond to climate change in terms of mitigation and adaptation measures. In infrastructure investment and management, municipalities have to invest in measures to reduce their carbon footprint of their infrastructure investments and improve the resilience of infrastructure. A recent study has indicated that most of the available technical capacity in the country is more in the private sector, and the private sector also has the financial means to invest in infrastructure. Informed by these observations, then the conference resolved to support municipalities to explore modalities for alternative and innovative partnerships with the private sector that are permitted by the municipal supply chain management regulations. These include unsolicited bids as well as donations and gifts. Donations have a potential to serve as an alternative to addressing some forms of shortages in the infrastructure delivery value chain. As a result, municipalities have a donation policy in place, but also encourage municipalities to plan for partnerships. The South African Local Government Municipal Systems Act requires the Council to approve decisions made with respect to new service delivery mechanisms. The Council can approve on an in-principle basis a new service delivery mechanism which has been researched and reported upon by Council officials. This decision-making power allows for new mechanisms of partnership between the public and private sector to proceed in terms of the law. The study also highlighted that when considering partnerships with private sector actors, municipalities will always retain the risk, as it is their mandate to fulfill certain functions and responsibilities. However, partnerships should be entered into with an understanding of the risk, and municipalities should build in the risk mitigation measures into the municipal policies and into the partnership agreements. One important factor is leveraging the resources of private parties through partnerships. However, a challenge to be addressed with this is the capacity of municipalities to play their respective role. The decision to initiate a partnership to provide a service requires that each stage, inception, feasibility study, procurement, and contract management, is capably undertaken. Capability should measure technical, financial, and managerial capacity as well as ethical capacity. Recent experience shows that transactions advisory services in establishing public-private partnerships is a critical and costly service that must be planned for and budgeted for appropriately. There is also a need to plan for the time when the partnership ends and the service is to be returned to the municipality, because it shouldn't be an open-ended type of thing. So, distinguished delegates, in closing, I would like to highlight that the key engagement with the private sector through both the PPPs and other forms of partnership is the leadership that is required within the municipality. This is because complexity is inherent on the nature of the public-private partnerships and the nature of municipal functions. This requires strategic thinking, ability to leverage and consolidate resources, as well as relationship building and management. Thank you.
So, Councillor Pakati, thank you very much for those reflections on the collective. I think it's important to emphasize the collective action that has been taken at a municipal level. So really, agreeing across the range of municipalities we have in South Africa. And I think it's an important basis for partnerships, for the degree of collaborative action that we need to see. I think building resilience, adapting to climate change is complex. It plays across different sectors, plays across different communities, and there are different dimensions to it that impact on the social, that impact on obviously the businesses that are key to livelihoods, to economic competitiveness. So having a very deliberate and managed, considered approach to building the partnerships, to bringing in key actors and to providing the processes, the systems that allow that to occur on a continued basis is something that is really critical. So we look forward to, I think, watching that space evolve and also being, I think, matched by the kinds of programs, the kinds of implementation action that we need to see on the ground, from which communities and others can benefit. I'm now going to move on to Storm Patel, who's going to give us a sense of, from a business perspective, and obviously located in a space that can be quite complex in terms of understanding the degree of the risks that businesses face, but also understanding the importance of those businesses in the community and the broader economy. Storm, if you can just share with us, from your perspective, I think the importance of collaboration with government, yes, but also looking at how you're understanding risk and how that features as well in shaping your discussions and the types of partnerships that you're building. Okay.
Good morning, Premier and my esteemed panel members. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of the panel today. Thank you again. This is really a very important aspect of how we look at adaptation and resilience, the partnerships. We know that no one player is going to be able to deal with the situation alone. So creating these types of partnerships between the private sector and government is very essential. From a SASL perspective, I thought let me just give a view of how we are doing this at the moment. So we are certainly actively working with government in aligning our strategies with government policies, sharing our expertise in the space, and then collectively working towards building resilience. Currently, we're participating in the various technical working groups that are being led by DFFE, focusing on contributing to the South African Adaptation Chapter, as well as the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy. In addition, we are also looking at finalizing the adaptation strategy for the regions where we are operating. So I think, taking the national view and then, to use a climate change term, downscaling it down to the more regional level is very important, because we know that adaptation and resilience and response needs to be local and needs to be very specific. We found that, for example, our operations in Sasolburg and Secunda are going to experience very, very different impacts compared to our operations in Mozambique. And these aren't very far away from each other, but already the strategy to manage the problems that we will see in the future will need to be very different. We've also conducted downscaled modeling, and for those of you that have had the privilege of seeing downscaled modeling, you can understand that it is a very complex, very technical application of science, and it's also very costly to do. So we have shared our downscaled modeling in the regions where we operate, because it is something that is certainly that can benefit all that operate within that region. We certainly believe that it's incumbent on all players to work with government to create a conducive regulatory environment that supports sustainable business operations. The recent floods in KZN really did provide a stark reminder to how important this is. Because whilst we don't have operations in KZN, we experience disruptions to our operations, disruptions in transport, non-operational port facilities, damage to rail infrastructure. And this caused us to call or declare a force majeure, because we were just unable to get product to where it needed to be. And it was only really by working with the various stakeholders that we were able to manage the situation. We had to make daily adjustments to our rail and road movements, finding alternative routes. So again, I think that was an excellent, very recent reminder of how important these partnerships are, and how in only working together and working on the ground and adapting as we go are we able to overcome challenges. This really leads nicely onto the second part of your question around our strategy to build resilience in our own operations. So our strategy is really to move from being reactive, so responding once we have had a situation, once they've happened, moving towards being more proactively being prepared for an event that may happen to our plants, our people, and our communities. So to do this, we've taken an approach of trying to, or aiming to, integrate climate change into our existing processes. So what we've really done is we don't want adaptation and climate change to be this standalone thing that needs to be managed by the company. It's something that actually needs to be built into the DNA of your daily operations. So in order to do that, we've really taken our existing processes, our existing infrastructure across risk management, operations, site-specific processes, our capital projects, our supply chains, and as well as our community engagements, just to name a few, and integrated these elements of adaptation into it. So maybe to just give a bit of a practical example of what this means, what it really means to integrate the science that is formed by downscaled modeling into procedures and then taking action accordingly. So we know that climate change impacts, they're not going to be a simple linear projection of what happened in the past, which is typically how plants and communities and all sorts of resilience is modeled, it's designed and maintained for this linear projection into the future. For example, we know that with things like increasing wet bulb temperature, our cooling towers may not be able to operate as efficiently as they do today into the future. So we need to cater for that in terms of design and operational changes. Other things we have to ask ourselves is, are any of our equipment on flooding plains? So do we need to look at raising them off the ground or increasing the frequency of our maintenance schedules to ensure that there's no blockages and water can flow in an unobstructed way away from our assets? On the people front, given that temperature extremes are expected to be far more frequent into the future, do we need to look at shifting our working hours so that our people are not exposed to these temperatures during a normal working day? On a community aspect, is there an opportunity for us to extend our early warning signals into the communities to help preparedness? Do we need, for example, we saw in Mozambique that stockpiling of certain critical resources may be required because as you have increasing flooding, you're not able to get the supplies that you need to people. You're not able to, drive the trucks into the areas. So these are some of the things that we are seriously thinking about, and we are already implementing a lot of these changes and updating our procedures. One last aspect, and this will tie very nicely, we have a panel tomorrow discussing carbon offsets, but offsetting is one mechanism where we really see a huge opportunity to integrate all elements of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and building community resilience through implementation of things like smart agricultural projects, and other elements like that. And in this way, you have this wonderful marriage of being able to deal with mitigation and adaptation whilst also improving community resilience. So that is a focus of ours from our carbon offsetting program to really make sure that we integrate all of these elements into it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Storm. I think you referencing a whole range of critical interventions, but perhaps just to kind of summarize in this context, my reflections on what I've heard thus far, and in terms of the partnerships that can be enabled and the frameworks and the necessary governance structures that you need to put in place. I think an excellent starting point around the data. So being prepared, not reactive, but really being, anticipatory in our approaches and the sharing of that data, really providing the basis for the scenarios that different actors can start to use to understand the range of impacts that one can anticipate and be far readier if those should come, but also be anticipatory in terms of putting in measures that reduce that impact as well. I think that's something that is quite key, and perhaps in the framework that was referenced from a local government level, I think I hear the beginnings of more advanced, more innovative governance structures, because these sorts of things they're long-term. It's not just a once-off initiative. It's a new way of working that we have to adopt and have to make sure is really efficient in order to deliver the impact that we need to see going forward. I'd like to call on our next panelist, Mr. Jordan Harris. And Jordan is from Regions 4, and they've been doing a lot of work on adaptation in this space in general, and have a good sense of some of those ingredients that make for successful partnerships. I'd like to please perhaps just give us a sense a bit more about your organization, some of those things that you've encountered, what are you seeing, and your reflections on what you think is key for really building the kinds of partnerships we need to see going forward.
Sure, I'll speak from here if that's okay. Yeah, first, thank you very much to the Premier and to KwaZulu-Natal, the whole team, for putting this together and for inviting me to participate on this panel, and also wanted to congratulate you for the panel. I think it's quite a really interesting group with varied perspectives, right, that really kind of brings a lot of the different voices and visions to the table, both from two different levels of government, right, as well as from the private sector itself. In my case, I represent a region, a network of state and regional provincial governments from around the world, Regions 4. So it's a network that works on climate change, on biodiversity conservation, on localizing SDGs. And within our climate program, we concentrate primarily on adaptation and resilience. So through our Regions Adapt platform, of which KwaZulu-Natal is committed to the race to resilience, for example, through this platform, we encourage, right, and provide support for subnational governments from around the world to develop dedicated adaptation and resilience strategies, and then find the ways to implement those strategies and have concrete actions on the ground. So I think maybe just some reflections. Historically, we know that the private sector has often kind of historically in the past been seen as almost an obstacle, right, to making progress on climate change. This is something that has completely been reversed and turned on its head in recent years, because now we obviously recognize that the participation, engagement of the private sector is essential, right? If we really want to make the transition that we need to make towards a carbon neutral and resilient future. But of course, there are many challenges that still remain, in particular in the most energy, water-intensive, extractive industries, right? There are still significant challenges on the road ahead. And what we can also see is that the private sector is also directly affected and impacted by the impacts of climate change, right? Just as our local communities and local governments, right? The private sector also faces these kinds of similar challenges. I've been asked as well to kind of reflect on some of the best practices. So part of the work that we do in Regions 4 is to identify some of the innovative ways in which subnational governments are partnering with the private sector and implementing actions that are compelling resilient strategies on the ground. I won't go into great detail, but I do encourage all of you to log on to our case study database. So on the Regions 4 website, you can find an open source case study database that goes into great detail on certain case studies from around the world on a variety of topics. And there's a few of those are what I'm going to just briefly mention today. So for example, I can point to the case of Jalisco State in Mexico. They've worked very closely with the tequila industry, which, as you may not know, tequila depends on agave plants, right? So this is a very water-intensive and soil-intensive industry, agricultural industry in Mexico that has also produced a great deal of deforestation. So they've produced a certification program for deforestation-free tequila production, where they've worked very closely with large-scale agricultural farmers and small-scale farmers of agave within the state in order to assist them in making this transition to more sustainable farming practices that will also allow for the end product, the bottle of tequila that you might buy in the supermarkets, to be certified as not having an impact with regards to deforestation within Jalisco. And this has been quite successful, and they're seeking now to replicate this same program in different states in Mexico. In the case of Catalonia in Spain, I can also mention the Catalan climate credit system. So this is a system of offsets, right, where private entities can purchase climate credits, and those funds go directly to sustainable forest management, sustainable water management practices, right? In particular with local communities, that allows them to implement, different kinds of resilience-based, locally led adaptation practices, and allows, of course, for compensating for the excessive water consumption and carbon emissions by the private sector. So that's also a system that generates some interest. And then also I just wanted to mention that I think it's important that we also, and it's been mentioned as well by the Premier and the Councillor, that when we think about the private sector, we shouldn't always think about the large industries, right? The private sector is also small-scale farmers. It's also small and medium-sized enterprises. Small local entrepreneurs are also part of the private sector, and can be beneficiaries of many of these actions as well, to rein in this transition in the kinds of practices that we want to see. So I've been talking as well with governments such as Paraná in Brazil, such as Yucatan, again in Mexico, as well as Cross River State in Nigeria, who have implemented different examples of payment for environmental services, right, or bioeconomy, where you integrate local communities into sustainable economic practices and sustainable use of forests and local lands, that also in the case of Yucatan, for example, integrates ancestral indigenous knowledge and practices into regarding their farming practices, and encourages other farmers to adopt those kinds of practices. So it's also important, I think, that we have a more flexible view, right, of what the private sector is and who it consists of. With regards to the challenges, of course, especially in the developing world, there are many challenges because there's a lot of mistrust, especially from local communities, often rightly so, right? Often there are significant environmental and even social liabilities, impacts, right, as a result of some of the practices that leads to the private sector often being perceived as operating only on more a self-interested basis. But on the other hand, also communities often, based on certain experiences, are quite closed as well to even having a dialogue, right, or even considering that the private sector can make significant contributions. So there, I think the role of subnational governments is key. And as we've seen in the case of KwaZulu-Natal, we're through the Climate Council, where they bring together different sectors and different actors to have those dialogues, to involve in participatory planning processes. This is really key for, I think, rebuilding that trust, right, and bringing people together at the table and highlighting what are the different roles and responsibilities in resilience on a local level. And finally, I guess in terms of different kinds of maybe advice based on what we've seen from different examples from around the world, would be to be open to different kinds of collaboration. I think also it's oftentimes the private sector is seen as from different other sectors as a source of funding, solely as a source of resources, which in some cases may be true, and that's great, but in other cases, that's not the only asset that they can provide. They can provide a great deal of knowledge and capacity building, technical capacities, technology, that the councillor has also mentioned. So just to be open and creative in terms of the different kinds of collaborations that we can make, and to seek out opportunities to involve the private sector in local planning exercises, as well as to look at their role in implementing subnational climate adaptation plans. There really is a need, and I think the case for the role of the private sector in terms of mitigation is quite well established, and we really need to start focusing on the resilience economy, because there are a great deal of services, technologies that are required to generate resilience, whether it's infrastructure or whether it's low-tech technologies as well for local communities to be able to build up their own collective enterprises. these are all things that will require a great deal of engagement, and it's something that I think from the subnational government perspective, there's a great deal of opportunity to generate that. So.
I think some really great insights there. Thank you very much for sharing that, and I'm very pleased to hear that the province is part of that platform and really has access to this huge collective mind, I think, where there are so many lessons and insights stored, and it's really about us being very deliberate in extracting those. I do appreciate also your comments, and it's something that I can relate to as being part of the NBI, really creating the spaces for different, stakeholders to come together and in a partnership. So it's not just about perhaps getting something specific from the other actor, but it's really about acknowledging that we have a common interest, we have a common objective, and we can build partnerships that are sustained. For me, it's a new way of governance. It's not an us or them situation when dealing with something that is this complex, that is completely pervasive and has multiple impacts like climate change and both aspects, as you've mentioned. And I think the other thing that's really important for a country like South Africa is just realizing the size of the opportunity that's sitting in providing the goods and services, as you mentioned, that can drive economic growth, that can drive inclusion, that can respond to the poverty challenges that we face as a country as well. So thank you very much for those inputs, and I know we are coming towards the end of our session. So I would like to invite, I think, our panelists, and we'll allow the Premier to give the final comment, but just some of those reflections as we leave this room. Where to from here? What inspires? What are you thinking? And let's conclude on that, and we'll let the Premier give us that final input. So perhaps, Mr. Harris, if I can start with you, first of all, to just give us some of those closing thoughts before we end the session.
Sure. No. Again, I think the panel discussion has been outstanding, and it really is a testament to the work that's being done in South Africa, in particular in KwaZulu-Natal and other provinces, right, where we can really see the essential role of subnationals in bringing people together, right? I think another reflection perhaps on something that the Premier mentioned at the very beginning, the importance of creating, in the enabling conditions, right, and the policy conditions, and the importance of regulation, the private sector understanding that these regulations are there for a reason, that there needs to be a series of regulations that guide us into a resilient future, and at the same time, other policies that provide incentives for the new kinds of industries that we want to see, for the best practices within existing industries that we want to see, the new kinds of private and industrial models that are required in the context of a resilient future that we really are urgently need to address. So I think, of course, at the national level, there's a policy framework that sets the stage, but it's really on the ground, in the territories, in the provinces, in the municipalities, where those come to fruition, where we really see the concrete end results of what those policies are. So I think, just as a final reflection, would be that the subnationals that are leading in this regard, such as KwaZulu-Natal, among many others from around the world, we can look to them for an example, and we can all expect them to kind of provide that space for participation amongst different stakeholders.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Maybe, Storm, if I can move to you next to give us your closing thoughts, hopes, reflections as we end the session.
Thank you. So I think there can be a lot of noise in this space, and it can be very overwhelming. It's terminology, I'm saying it again, downscaled modeling, it's adaptation, resilience. These are big words, but I think at the end of the day, I think when we need to cut through the noise and realize we know how to deal with this. We have the foundation, we have the existing systems. We just need to leverage what is already there. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's inform the design of that wheel. I think, it's been quite a journey for me in the adaptation space, where I took a very sort of academic approach to this, and I thought that I had to reinvent something new. But once I scratched below the surface, I realized that we know how to do this. We just have to do it in a very informed way, so that we don't spread the very little resources that we have, we spread them too thin, and that we don't direct them to the wrong places. So I think my final parting word is, we've got this, we can do this. Thank you.
I'm very happy to hear that. I'm just reflecting on one of the comments that you made, Councillor, at the beginning, and you spoke about leadership. And I think that's such a key part of activating the kinds of action that we need, taking that leadership role. If I may invite you beyond, the comments that you've made on some of your reflections and what you're thinking around building the partnerships and collaborations for adaptation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Climate change is the most pressing challenge of our time, and it cannot be resolved by government alone. And that partnerships with the private sector are very necessary for us to be able to deal with this matter. But the regulatory environment resides with the government. The municipalities should create climate change mitigation and adaptation policies at that level, but also Cabinet has adopted climate change implementation or just transition implementation plan. And all those plans will have to be implemented at a municipal level, because this takes place in a ward where people are. It then necessitates that communities should also be mobilized and be made aware of the implications of climate change, both on a number of issues, infrastructure, as well as food production, and all those issues require leadership at a municipal level to be agile and be able to do mobilization. But also, national government should help us by creating institutional arrangements for us to be able to enter into such partnerships. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And I do think that that space is growing, and we continue to look out and look forward to the leadership that's provided on different spheres of government. I'd now like to hand over to the Premier to close the session for us and give us one or two remarks as we prepare for the next session.
No, thank you very much to all the colleagues for their contributions. I think the climate change issues, the climate is changing now. It's not changing tomorrow, it's not changing yesterday. And our people are facing problems now. And it calls for stronger leadership. It calls for less talk and more collaboration in terms of making sure that all our resources are pulled together for the better of our community, to save our community, but also to save the generation, the next generations, so that they have an environment to which to live at. But also so that we can also be able to say there has been a foundation that has been laid for those that are coming after us to be able to move forward. So the leadership for me, both at the private and public level, communities are an important part of this, because you can't leave anybody behind. I always say that these terms can be very intimidating, as you say. We need to make sure that we talk something that makes sense to the communities there. You cannot talk something, we live in a province that is very rural, and I cannot talk about the Paris Agreement when people are hungry, when people are not having infrastructure such as energy, water, and all of those things should be able to be meaningful to a person, so that if I say, let's grow more trees, let's make more gardens, let's ensure that we plant more fruit trees. The reasons for that is that our soil degradation is getting us worse. When there's flooding, everything moves. So everything that we are doing has got to make sense to the learner at school, at the kindergarten level, the kind of, environments that our children are growing at should be the ones that even tell me as a parent, that as a parent, you can't throw these boxes in the bin. As a parent, when you finish with the scan, you can't throw it in the bin. And we must create that kind of environment where practice and attitudes is something that tells everybody that we are in a very, we have very different situation, but also the agency which we need to act. It's about as important as what we do today and what we do tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those closing remarks, Premier. I think important words for me there are agency. I think we need to reflect and remember that building resilience, ensuring that we're able to adapt is also part of the conversation on the just transition. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to rest on those partnerships where we are all coming together with a sense of responsibility, accountability, ownership, but also the opportunity to access the benefits of really considered and collaborative action. With that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us in this session. I know that the next session is itching to get ready, and we'll ask you to please join us for the next session and welcome you to stay at the South Africa Pavilion. Thank you.